thank you very much, Isabel. I have to say that one of my favorite things at the museum is our speaker series, and so it's an honor to be asked to get to do this today. Also wanted to thank Dr. Birdsong is sitting in the back for his assistance. He helped with the title and some information that you'll hear about just a little bit later in the presentation, so thank you. And also all of you for being here today. It's not much of a talk without anybody to talk to, so I realize there are other things going on this week, and thanks very much for being here. When I start talking with our visitors, as Isabel mentioned, I docent, and so we have a lot of people who come in from other places often. I'm always intrigued with beginning there, because so much of Fernandina's story, I think, really does come down to people who came here. Some decided to stay, some decided to be here for a while and then move on. And that's the case of the two women we're going to be talking about today. They certainly were players, huge players, on the national scene, even international, some people could argue. And also, I think that not only did they influence events around them while here, but also I think that their time here and in this area influenced them, which I think is pretty impressive for people who had a lot going on if you look back at their lives' biographies. So if I said the names of the two Harriets, Harriet Tubman and Harriet Beecher Stowe, probably at least for most of you, a sentence or two would pop into your head, and for some a lot more, you may have studied them. If you look at sort of their career paths, you have three major episodes for each one. The ones that we're going to talk about today really are the middle section for Harriet Tubman, the time that she was in this area and what she was doing here, as well as Harriet Beecher Stowe, who, you know, we know her from being the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which of course came out earlier than when she was here. But her second act, and this is really true I think for both of them, second act really, much of it came while she was in this area, and particularly in Mandarin. So think about a moment about these two women. I want to pose this question to you right now. We'll come back with a different version of it later. But how were these women different? They couldn't have, at first blush, probably been more different, except united in their sense of the importance of abolition of slavery. We'll talk a little bit about their biographies, but just starting out thinking about two people who came in life from very different places, but with very similar goals, I think, at the end of the day. So what got us to the time period where they were here? Because they were here overlapping within about 3 years of each other. And that was in the era of the Civil War, and then into right after the war was over. If you look at the early 1850s, there was so much going on. And I think I heard somebody talking the other day, a historian, who said really it was almost inevitable that this country was going to end up in a civil war. And so much of the events that happened in the 1850s, starting with the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, I'm sorry, I'm probably going to do that a bunch today. So, you know, what that said, it was essentially that anybody who assisted a person in escaping slavery, whether they were in a free state or not, and I mean the person who had done the assisting as well as the former enslaved person, was guilty of a federal crime. And as you can imagine, that was a major event for the country as a whole. It's important for a lot of reasons, obviously, but one that was particularly important is that it is said to have been one event that really inspired Harriet Beecher Stowe to write Uncle Tom's Cabin. She at the time was living with her family in Ohio, which was a free state, but next to Kentucky, which was not. And there were many stories about people being snatched off the streets, people who had made their way to a free state being snatched off the streets in return. with obviously tragic consequences. And so that story is supposed to have been inspired by true events. As they got to the middle part of the 1850s, things began to really start to speed up. You all probably know the story we think Congress is rough these days, and it is. But you had Charles Sumner, a senator from South Carolina, and Representative Preston Brooks from Massachusetts literally come to blows on the Senate floor. And it's said that Sumner was almost beaten to death, and emotions had gotten so high at this point. It was 2 years before he went back to the Senate as a result of the injuries. The Dred Scott decision, of course, which basically stripped what few rights African Americans had left from them in terms of being able to sue and being able to be treated remotely fairly under the justice system. The raid by John Brown on Harper's Ferry arsenal, he was trying to inspire a slave uprising in hopes that it would mean the end of slavery. As you know, it did not work out that way. Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1861, and then by April of 1861, Fort Sumter was fired on. We had states seceding, including Florida, which was the third of the southern states to leave the Union. So all of that was sort of setting the scene, really, for this war that by that point had become pretty clearly inevitable. So I want to talk a little bit separately now about the two Harriets and their story. Harriet Tubman, I have to say, was just one of the most remarkable women in history. I mean, when you think about, I don't know if y'all play this game, I do sometimes, who would I like to meet if I could go back in history and meet somebody? She would be at the top of the list. I mean, she was a phenomenal person in terms of her life story. She was, of course, a runaway slave. She escaped in her early 20s. But not only was that pretty exceptional, but she led at great risk to her own life because of all the punishments that were in place. Over the course of 14 years, many people along the Underground Railroad to freedom. At her birth, there was really no reason to think that she would have such a remarkable life, or really that would even know her name now. That was the fate of most people who were born into slavery. Her birthday is a little hazy in that she said 1825. There were others that said no, they don't think so. They think she was maybe a little bit older than that. But nonetheless, that was not unusual. The important life events of people who were enslaved often were not recorded: births, deaths, marriages, etc. So we don't really know. I wanted to mention the image that you see over here is from a series that was done by the artist Jacob Lawrence, who was part of the Harlem Renaissance. He did a whole series of images of Harriet Tubman. He admired her greatly, and this is one that represents her childhood. She was born, again, as I said, she said about 1825, on the Broadest Plantation, which is in Bucktown, Maryland. It is not public. You can't go visit that site, but the farm is still there. She remembered as a small child 2 sisters who were sold away into slavery, and the family never knew the fate of those daughters. She was one of 10 children, I think, and her father was a freedman. Her mother was enslaved by the Broadest family, which meant that any children who were born, slavery followed the mother. And so the children's status was the same as the mother's status, so all the children were born into slavery. She found that her calling in terms of her work assignment was more working outside. Her dad ran a lumber mill for a white man. He really ran the facility and was known as quite a strong businessman. Harriet liked working with him and spent a lot of time, as a result, out in the woods, learning about the plants, what they could do, and so forth, which, as it turned out, was a pretty good skill set for some of her later activities. So that was her childhood. The other thing that's important to know about her is that she suffered a traumatic brain injury as a young teen, she was trying to slow down a slave owner who was chasing a young man who had tried to escape from him. She knew he was going to be punished if he was caught, so she stepped between them, which apparently enraged the man who was trying to do the catching. He picked up a weight, it's described as a 2-pound metal weight, and threw it at her head, hit her, fractured her skull, they're pretty sure, and she almost died. It took months for her to recover, and when she did recover, for the rest of her life, she would suffer, she called them visions, but hallucinations and what they think, most of the doctors who've talked about it that I've heard say they think was probably narcolepsy. So she could be in the middle of a conversation and just drop off, and everybody who knew her kind of knew, just hang on, she'll be back with you. Apparently it did happen a few times when she was leading groups of people, under cover of darkness out, but they had enough confidence in her that they hung in. But that was something that really plagued her for her entire life. So in 1844, she married a man named John Tubman and changed her name from Ross. She was born Araminta Ross, and her last name became Tubman. Still, she actually used the nickname Minty and went by that. So they lived together for 5 years, but remember, so he was also free, but she was still enslaved, so that basically meant she had no legal rights. And she heard in 1849 that the man who owned the plantation where she lived, he had died, and she heard that the slaves, or at least most of the slaves, were going to be sold at that point. And she knew that there was basically nothing the legal system could do for her, and so if she was going to be free, she was going to have to take matters into her own hands. So she decided to run and escape. She tried to talk him into going. He did not do it. He didn't apparently say absolutely under no circumstances, but he did not agree to go on that trip. And so as she got ready to do what she knew she needed to do, changed her first name to Harriet. That actually was not unusual to have the name change. In fact, many people who went through the Underground Railroad or escaped would change their name for a couple of reasons. One was to cover their identity, and the other was was maybe more symbolic, to say I am a new, reborn, free person. So this happened a lot. If you look at this graphic, I know it's a little tough to read, but Minty, who's referred to, age 27, that's Harriet Tubman. And this was the ad that was posted in the newspaper for her. She went, everybody believes that she went on her own, so the other two men who are listed had escaped apparently, but they were not traveling as a group together. So this is one date we do know. September 17th, 1849 is when she took off for the north. And what she did was she followed the typical route on the Underground Railroad. There were 3 routes that people seemed to take. The one she took her into Pennsylvania by following the North Star at night. She did all of her traveling at night, and it took about 3 weeks to get there. So this is the path that we think she took, and that was the one that was most commonly used. The Underground Railroad, just a little bit of background on it, it started in around 1820. It was primarily operated by men, and by that I mean they were the ones that were doing transport, if there was transport, like hiding somebody in a wagon or whatever. Many of them were Quakers. This was a very common thing. It was concentrated, we talk about the Underground Railroad, really there were 2. There was the northern route, which is the one she was on. There was the southern route, which actually came to Florida and to Texas. It was a much smaller operation. But one thing that changed over the period of time that the Underground Railroad happened was where did it go? So a lot of the northern cities, if they wanted to stay in the U.S., were where they went. Once the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, that was a bit less attractive than it had been previously. So many went on to Canada. And in fact, she worked both options during the time that she was doing it. At one point, her parents, she was able to get out, and they went to Canada and then came back to New York later on when things changed. We really don't know, frankly, a lot of things about the Underground Railroad. I mean, just for obvious reasons, there was not a lot of benefit in writing down the details. Oh, I helped 100 people this month, because if that evidence was found with the Fugitive Slave Act, that was only evidence against you. Mm-hmm. And so there are many things that we, as historians, don't know that we wish we knew. As you can imagine, people who want to, African American people who would like to know more about their family genealogy may not be able, in fact, quite likely are not able to find that if their family was part of the Underground Railroad. Things did turn up. There were stories of people who were involved with the Underground Railroad who did write things down, and their family was so afraid of what the consequences might be if they were caught that it was destroyed at the time. So we know that happened. But there are occasionally, one cool thing about history, I think, is the fact that it can turn up and surprise you even hundreds of years later. Think about the Dorian dig here on the island, for example. Where was that mission for several years, 100 years? And I think as recently as 2009, somebody found in their attic a stash of details, sort of the Rosetta Stone of a group of people who had been held, their previous name, their slave name, and their new name, and where they went, where they came from, where they went. So it is possible that documents could still be found to give us more detail. But right now, it's a very wide range. But the estimates are between 30,000 and 100,000 people who traveled the Underground Railroad. We don't know a lot about what happened then. Were they then caught up as part of the Slave Act and brought back, or did they go on to live lives in wherever city they went to? So, lots to be found here. If you're interested in pursuing historical questions, this is a good area to start.
There were a lot of Quakers in Philadelphia.
Mm-hmm.
Is that why they went to Philadelphia, maybe?
It probably was, because the Quakers were definitely the most consistently supportive of the idea. And you think about it, it went on for the 1820s into the Civil War era, and that's a lot of time to build up safe houses and plots to foil the people who are on your tracks. But yeah, it was definitely, and not just the Quakers, although the Quakers were probably the single most important group, but religious ties in general. It was very much tied in with America's strong interest in religion at that point. And we'll see that, I think, with Harriet Beecher Stowe's story a little bit too. In addition, in Harriet Tubman's situation, as I said, she was illiterate, so she was not able to write, even if she had wanted to, herself, her story. She did do a book later on with an author, but this was not the period of the tell-all book, as you can imagine, and there was not a lot of incentive. Think about like the French Resistance, for example. How many years has it taken for us to start hearing a lot of the details of what happened there? There were too many people during her lifetime who still could have, if not been punished legally, ostracism, or whatever. There was a lot of reason to not give the details of what she was doing as well as what the movement was doing. She said, though, in her book that I mentioned, and there were two versions of it that came out. One was not very long after the war in 1869, and the second version came out in 1886. And so Harriet told the story herself, that she said that she made 19 trips back to rescue people, and that she thought that it was roughly 300 people that followed her specifically. So we do know some things from her lips, but there's not a ton of that information. I put the word abductor in quotes up there because even the language was and is somewhat a little bit controversial. Was she a conductor on the Underground Railroad? A lot of people preferred that term, or an abductor. You know, think about the different nuances on that. But anyway, she often made her trips, those 19 trips, often made them in the fall or the winter. And think about, why would you do that? Well, she was traveling at night, as I said, and she knew that there would be fewer people out when the weather was colder to, you know, accidentally or intentionally run into her group that she was leading. And so when she wasn't leading people, what was she doing? Well, she was she moved around a fair amount, understandably, but she would be raising money, basically, to fund her activities. She was tied in with some of the abolition groups, and they would help with some donations, but frankly, she did a lot of it with what she could raise herself. So she worked as a laundress, she worked as a baker, and basically self-financed much of what she was doing, especially in the early days. This particular image is one Elizabeth Catlett did in the 1940s, and one thing about Harriet Tubman you'll see is that she was really, has been very much adopted by the artistic community, and there are lots of very memorable pieces out there, like the Jacob Lawrence series that I mentioned to you. So that's Harriet Tubman before she gets here. I did mention that she did collaborate also with John Brown. There's not any indication that she was part of his more violent activities, but she knew him. She considered him a friend. And then Frederick Douglass as well. And Douglass, of course, stayed mostly in the North, writing and speaking and editing newspapers that were pro-abolition. So what happened in the period of time when she was here? This is where I think that Harriet Tubman had started her second act, because she was very much a person who had to work in the shadows, again, for all these obvious reasons, for the first part of her career as a abolitionist. People did not know initially whether she was a male or a female. They didn't know anything about what she looked like. They didn't know if she was one person or maybe a small composite group that was freeing all these folks. Eventually she got the title Moses of her people, and it became more obvious that she was probably one person, probably a woman, etc. So by the time she came here, there were some things known in the public about her, but it was still dangerous for her to be doing what she was doing. But when she moved into the Southeast, and specifically South Carolina and Florida, her career changed a bit. How did she come to be here? Well, first of all, she was working with the Union Army. The governor of Massachusetts had asked if she would consider officially working with the Army. And as it turned out, the generals who were in charge of this area were glad to get her, because she not only had the skills of the things that she was doing, she was obviously good moving through the forest at night with people following, but she also was really regarded as a very talented herbalist. She knew the plants, remember the work with her dad, and could mix concoctions that made people better. And this is how she came to be in Fernandina. She had officially volunteered as a nurse with the Army, and was at Fort Clinch when there was a bad dysentery outbreak. She came and actually seemed to have quite good success with helping make a lot of those soldiers healthier. The other thing that she did was sort of move into really a guerrilla paramilitary kind of position with the Army. And they assigned to her a small unit of about 10 men who would go on raids with her and help get the word out about the Emancipation Proclamation, which of course had been issued, started at 63. Get the word out. And also the other thing that she was doing was a lot of recruiting work. At this point, African American men could become soldiers for the Union with full, privileges in terms of being able to carry weapons and so forth. Up until that point, yes, they could be in the Army, but they could only be in sort of a service capacity and not armed. But Union Generals Higginson and Montgomery apparently saw something in Harriet Tubman, and apparently were the kinds of generals that were willing to go a little rogue. And so they worked with her to set up this paramilitary unit, and they trusted her to do her thing. So while she was here, she had her day, as I tell my visitors downstairs, she had her day job and her night job. The day job basically was working with the medical folks at Fort Clinch. And of course, Fort Clinch was mostly used as an infirmary, as you remember. And so she would be there working with the soldiers. She was, what they wrote down said, very caring person, very effective. The soldiers really like her. And that's how, actually, it's the soldiers how we know she was there, because several of them put in their diary that they had met Harriet Tubman. They were pretty thrilled. Unfortunately, apparently, none of them put in their diary the date they met her, so we don't know exactly when she was here, but we did know that she was here in 63. The other thing is the nighttime job, like I mentioned. She was an excellent recruiter for the Army, and that was no small thing, because by the end of the war, about 10% of the Union Army was composed of African American soldiers, so about 200,000 men. Many of them came from the South Carolina and Florida area. If you've seen the movie Glory that came out several years ago now, it talks about the Massachusetts Regiment, which was important, absolutely, but per capita, more soldiers came from this area, and they were really important too, not only as traditional march, and stand behind the cannon soldiers. They also, because they knew this area so well, they were very good spies and scouts. They knew the rivers, the waters, and think about how important that would be to have that knowledge base. And so getting those folks was really important, and she was a rock star recruiter for them. This is what Harriet herself said about being in Fernandina. This is from her second edition of her biography, and it is really all she said about it. We're still wondering, and some of you in this room may know more than I do about this, but we're still wondering, how long was she here? Was she only at Fort Clinch? Did she go out into some other places, maybe where there was some support activity going on and provide nursing? I don't know. I think there's a great book to be written there if anybody's able to get the information. Rhonda? We'll ask her. She was highly respected by the officers. As I mentioned, the two generals that she worked with must have been pretty creative guys, because they were willing to let her have a lot of trust. She was actually called by the general. This is sort of a list of things she probably should have gotten medals for that were accomplished with her and the small unit that was assigned to her, as well as the other soldiers that were working in this area. Because, remember, Florida was not so much a shooting war during the Civil War. Yes, we had a battle or two of note, but really this was a lot more about kind of under the radar sort of activity, and she was the perfect person, clearly, for that role. But you can see, not only was she here, but a lot of towns that I couldn't even tell you exactly where they are anymore, that she was involved with. She was also known, another thing, thank goodness that she had some time with the Army, because they were pretty good about writing things down, if not all the guerrilla activity, at least sort of the big picture. And in written records, she was referred to as a valuable woman. We know that the Secretary of War, Lincoln's Secretary of War, said that she was to have passage on any troop transport that she encountered and asked for. And she was also given authorization to get supplies from any of the quartermasters, etc., to help fund her activities. People being what they are, and her not being able to really tell folks around her what was going on, she ran into a lot of jealousy on that idea of being able to go up and ask for the supplies you need during a time when people were, on rationing. You can understand where why is she getting it and I don't get anything. She was not paid by the government. Even though she was working for the Army, she was not paid by them. And after the war, people, including some very high up people like Seward, the Secretary of State, tried to get her a pension. He was actually friends, he and his wife were friends with her. because of the abolition movement that they had been active in. So they weren't able to ever, she never was a rich woman. Anyway, so they were trying to, she was trying to keep her activities going basically on her what she could come up with. So what she did was what she had done as a person with the Underground Railroad, and that was bake sale. she actually, so, you know, on the nights that she wasn't leading military expeditions, apparently she would make pies and gingerbread. She was known for having really great gingerbread, and you can actually find recipes on the internet, by the way, and would sell them to the soldiers many times. So when she was at Fort Clinch, I think that was part of how she was funding this operation. Mm-hmm. So what made her unique after all of this? What does it boil down to? Florida A&M not so long ago had an exhibition of her, some of her memorabilia, including her gun and her short sword, long knife that she was supposed to have used on the missions. And actually there is the story about that she didn't really have them to arm herself against the pursuers, the people coming along behind, that it was really to help encourage people not to sort of lose their courage and turn back. Because, you know, she said, if you're coming, you're staying. You know, that they could not afford to have people splintering off. And that a couple times she basically had to pull the gun on some of the folks that were going along. Apparently she did not shoot anyone during the process. But the things that made her unique out of all of this really comes down to there were few African Americans who were operating the structure, who were, you know, like at a high management level basically in the Underground Railroad. They really weren't in a position to be able to do it. They were very important in helping with things along the way, like the fact that there were quilts that were made that would be hung over railings of homes to say, this is the route you take. Mm-hmm. There was a lot of encoding that happened. And certainly African Americans were very involved in that, but they weren't necessarily the ones running the safe houses in large numbers. So you're getting some things not very nuanced, and I apologize for that. There were very few women who were actually kind of considered abductors or station masters involved, white or black, you know, south or north. But she was obviously very critical in the process. And because she was an escapee, she would have been subject to the most harsh kind of justice if she had, in using that word loosely, if she had been caught. And so, you know, understandably, once an enslaved person got out, they stayed out, you know, largely. And yet she came back, by her account, 15 or 19 times. So what was her final chapter? Well, she continued a life of philanthropy. She eventually settled in New York, Auburn, New York, and eventually was able to get some money from donations and so forth to be able to purchase enough land to create a home for indigent and elderly African Americans. She eventually lived there herself to be taken care of as she got old. And you can actually visit now that facility in the Harriet Tubman National Park. So this is one of the last photos that was made of her that we know of. She to me is an interesting person because I would say that the through line for Harriet Tubman was one that constantly really went more like this. You know, as her story became better known, I think the respect for her actually grew, and I think that's been, you know, we know America's history, but I think that's been a pretty consistent thing, that her reputation has only grown. Certainly we see her work now in all kinds of museums that have been named for her, artistic works, you've seen some of them on the slides here, books, and not just histories. She is really becoming more and more, I think, sort of a pop culture figure. And the $20 bill issue, we'll talk about that in a sec. This is another one from Jacob Lawrence's series about Harriet Tubman. This piece is one that's interesting. A few years ago, the Harn Museum, the Art Museum, had a presentation of his work. And I was docenting one night with a little girl came in who had studied Harriet Tubman in Stowe. It was white child, and I said, do you know who Harriet Tubman is? Boy, her eyes lit up, and she started deconstructing the art and the symbolism in this piece, and she was right on the money. I mean, and I said, well, why is this hand large? She said, because she reached out to people, you know, and she got it, the owl in the tree, because that was part of the code, you know, people signaling each other along the way that this was the safe route, or that somebody was coming. So that is neat, and I had a similar experience this last week. A little girl that was in the museum here, and as soon as I said, and Harriet Tubman was at Fort Clinch, you know, and she, so she told us about Harriet Tubman, and I just think that's so neat that she is somebody who is resonating so clearly.
She's pointing to the North Star.
Exactly, the North Star right there. So there's so much in her story that's right there. I could have just shown you all that and moved on, I guess, but it's amazing how much she is reflected in pop culture. Books are being produced left and right about her, and I think that's of all kinds. Motion picture, some of you may have seen the movie Harriet with the amazing Cynthia Erivo playing Harriet, and that, you know, historians always have issues with movies because they're like, well, they didn't get it completely right, and, you know, I mean, I can't argue with that. They probably didn't. But one thing, if you are interested and you hadn't seen this movie, and the whole how did she do those escapes thing is a question for you, because she did go back to the area she had come from. So not only could she have run into people who knew her, who did not have her best interest at heart, but she did run into them occasionally. And the book, I mean, the movie really tracks pretty closely what she said in her memoir about how she evaded people when she would come face to face. So it's got that, at least, even if you have problems with some of the rest of it. And, you know, 160 years after, we've still got the issue of controversy attached to her. Right now, you know, in 2016, there was a bill that passed Congress that said we're going to replace the Andrew Jackson $20 bill with the Harriet Tubman bill. Well, I suspect none of you have a Tubman in your pocket right now because it doesn't exist. It has run into all kinds of speed bumps. And the Jean Shaheen of New Hampshire, the senator, has introduced a bill this year trying to get it back on track. By 2030, you know, maybe it won't happen that soon, but it will be interesting to see, you know, if it happens. In my opinion, it should. But anyway, so that's Harriet Tubman. Let's talk about Harriet Beecher Stowe for just a sec, and her time and what she's known for. You know, at the time she was an author, there was the written word was mass media. You know, that was it. And her book had such an amazing ability to focus the nation's attention on the issues of slavery and the question of abolition of slavery. You know, it's hard to really overstate the impact that it had on focusing the public on this issue. You know, I think of Uncle Tom's Cabin in many ways as being sort of like the black and white footage that probably everybody has seen in Selma, Alabama, at the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the confrontation there where John Lewis was badly beaten and so forth. You know, if I say that, probably that image came up in your head immediately. Uncle Tom's Cabin was kind of the equivalent of that, I would say. You know, she drew pictures that once you read them and had them in your head, you couldn't unsee. And so that happened. It was, well, to give you an idea, Abraham Lincoln is supposed to have said this to her the only time they met. There are some people that say, well, we're not really sure he said it quite that. They do know he met. They was, you know, it's on the appointments calendar that they did meet one time. And it's one of those things that I've heard people say, well, if he didn't say it, he should have, you know, because it really did sum up how important her book ultimately proved to be. Frankly, it's hard to think of a single book that had the kind of influence this one did on American history. And you might nominate a couple of others, but this one was awfully important. To give you a little bit of timeline on Harriet Beecher Stowe, she was born in 1811. Slavery obviously was very much a part of the American landscape at that point. She had 12, there were 12 of them. She was the middle child. She married a man who was an educator named Calvin Stowe. They were very much New Englanders. And she taught for a number of years. One of her older sisters ran a fairly prestigious girls' school. Harriet taught in that school, but she also all along was writing to supplement her income, and because I think that's really what her heart's desire was. The three items that are in orange are what happened during her life here. Then Calvin died in 86. She died 10 years later in 96. And it's important to mention that religion and family history really shaped her. Religion was very important to this family, and it was at a time when religion was very important to America, a big part of the culture. Her dad was a Calvinist minister, pretty strict, pretty conservative. Her brother, Henry Ward Beecher, you may have heard that name. He was probably the 1880s or 1800s equivalent of a megachurch preacher. I mean, he was that well known, more liberal. Also a little bit controversial. He was caught up in a very public scandal which involved the wife of a parishioner. Oops. And it was part of a very highly publicized trial. He was eventually acquitted of bad deeds. But there was a lot of controversy attached to that. So the family was not without renown both ways. Many of the children, the siblings, were involved in some aspect of church life, either as ministers themselves, or some of them were religious journalists. And she did much of her writing also on that. But they were more liberal, basically, than their father had been, and she did also become an Episcopalian, she and Calvin both. So, in case you haven't looked at Uncle Tom's Cabin in the last few months, just to refresh your memory, it's a book that tells the story of an enslaved man, Uncle Tom, who is treated very badly all along the way. He was a really good guy, is the bottom line. And he, through no fault of his own, was being sold off and was on a boat headed to New Orleans when he saved the life of a little girl named Little Eva. Her father purchased Tom because he knew things were going to go badly for him in New Orleans. Out of gratitude, purchased him so he could try to make his life better. The little girl and Uncle Tom become close friends. She becomes ill. And on her deathbed, she gets her father to agree that he'll free all of the slaves he owns, which he intends to do. But he's killed, and Simon Legree becomes Tom's new owner. Legree ultimately has Tom whipped to death after he refuses to basically divulge the whereabouts of some runaway slaves. So, it's a really, it was done as a serial book, and so a chapter a month that would appear in the National Era, which was a church-related and run by the family publication. It came out in 10 installments. And if she missed an installment, the public was so into it that they would get at the newspaper they would get letters of complaint. Where's Uncle Tom's Cabin? And so it was extremely popular. When it was published as a book, that was always the intention. The book sold 10,000 copies in the first week. Now remember, this is a long time ago. By the end of the year, 300,000 copies. And it basically became, for many years after that, with the book that had sales second only to the Bible, even after the Civil War was over with. So it was an extremely popular book with the public. Now, that was then. And the legacy of Uncle Tom, I mentioned that the through line on Harriet Tubman was one that's been pretty steadily up. Not so much with Harriet Beecher Stowe, and this particularly the book. Again, thousands were sold. It became a very popular children's book, another version. Remember, this was a time when copyright was not so much a thing, and so many copies. It was translated, I think, in like 37 languages. She got basically nothing for that because copyright, again, didn't really exist, especially international. The second line, I think, is pretty key. Yes, the book went through some revision years later with people saying, you know, this book is not perfect. It has a lot of problems. There's a lot of language issues that through today's lens, absolutely, you can't say anything but that the language is racist. And that some of the scenarios are very paternalistic. That's all true, I think, if you read the book, that is there. It is considered the most banned book in America, depending on what metrics you're using. It is very controversial, and you know, we're certainly hearing a lot about banned books right now. So you have to say that. At the same time, I think that a lot of the initial revision about, hey, this isn't so great, there's a lot of bad language, African American people are treated with derision. Even the term Uncle Tom, you know, does not mean saintly man anymore, it means something else. All of that is true, and so that's where it went initially after the high praise. There also is sort of a movement, I think, right now of a revision of the revision, where people are kind of going back and saying, well, yeah, but remember the lens of the time, and lots of other things. And I'm not going to try to fully discuss that one today. There's just a lot there. But I think that it is true to say that there is kind of a lot of looking again and saying, how do we measure this, and what was the importance? So hopefully that is a quick overview of how that worked. So what happened, this is Harriet Beecher Stowe, who is, you know, just a huge celebrity because of the popularity of this book. What happened next? What do you do after you have that kind of success? Well, again, like Harriet Tubman, I think the time that she spent in this area is a bit of a second act for Harriet Stowe. She continued to write throughout the Civil War, but I think at this point she basically kind of realized that maybe she had done her part on that subject, and came back to do a lot of like sort of Martha Stewart things, you know, how to decorate your home and quick and easy recipes and so forth. She actually did a lot of cookbook related stuff, and so that's what she was doing up through the Civil War. But once the war was over, that's when we start the second act. And what happened there is she became important in promoting North Florida to the world, having a lot to do with us becoming considered a tourism site, and really the first tourism site for Florida. And the other piece of her, in addition to changing her writing and what she was writing about, she also rolled up her sleeves and got involved with the whole, what's known as the Yankee Stranger, by some people, movement. I hope you guys have had a chance to see the great temporary exhibit downstairs right now about the Sisters of St. Joseph. It's really a fine exhibit, and it's very much where she got involved in her second act. So why did she and Calvin decided in 1866 to come sort of dip their toe in the waters of Florida. And why initially did they come down here? They had, I think, 6 children as well. Unfortunately, one of their sons was a very troubled young man. He was an alcoholic, and he served in the Civil War, and almost certainly was a victim of PTSD. And so he was really kind of a lost soul, and they were hoping that they could find something that would give his life purpose and meaning. And so they rented land in Mandarin for him to, the idea was he was going to run the farm and, you know, get him far enough away from bars and saloons and have him working the fields and you know, get a healthier lifestyle. Sadly, it didn't work. He found a way to get to the bars and so forth at Jacksonville, and so eventually he just literally disappeared for the family. They never knew what happened to him. They know he went west, and one of his brothers went to look for him later, and they never heard from him again. So that obviously did not work the way they had hoped it would. To me, one of those weird little tidbits of history, the land that they rented for him was part of one of the Kingsley plantations of Laurel Grove. But anyway, Harriet particularly liked the area so much that they decided to purchase 30 acres themselves and build a home there, which they did. And the other thing was that she wanted to do something. Like I said, she rolled up her sleeves and she wanted to try to help all these people who had been freed, and children particularly, who had not had a chance to go to school. They had no ability to write or read in the black community, but also poor whites, that she wanted to do something and felt like with the resources that she had with the success of the book, that she could do something for other people. And so this was where she was going to try to do it. Mandarin at the time, you know, sleepy little town, very agricultural, very much right there on the river, wonderful place to grow citrus and so forth. And it was on the steamship route, but it didn't have a lot of you know, things going for it. So she said this has got potential. So she started doing what she did, which was writing. They built a home. She and Calvin built this home right there on the river. You'll notice the tree that's growing up in there. Yeah, it turns out not such a good idea, but we'll get to that in just a second. But anyway, people, it sat on the river, and there were stories, because again, she's a really famous person. Part of the reason she wanted to leave is because people kept coming to her house in Hartford, Connecticut, knocking on the door and wanting to sit down and chat with this best-selling author, who, by the way, lived next door to, does anybody know? Mark Twain. Yeah, their houses are right there, still are, right next to each other in Hartford, Connecticut. So, and some of them followed her to Florida, as it turned out, but nonetheless, they could sit there and wave at the steamships going by, and they went back. But as I mentioned, she was part of the Yankee Strangers movement. And what that was, many times they were Yankees, as in from the north. Hope I'm not offending anybody here. Sometimes they were from France, the St. Joseph's sisters, but people who came from away, who came to this area with the idea of trying to help. That there was a real need, that especially in the area of education, that there was a whole population that by law had been prevented from being able to read and write. So there was a real need for educators. And also, I think something that's kind of important, that second middle part, joined with the state's white community who did want to see change happen, some of them. And the idea was that they could work together to improve the lot. You know, that thing of, you raise the water and every boat comes up. I'm mangling that. But anyway, that being the idea that everybody would be better off if this group that was really disadvantaged was better off. And was it social engineering? Yeah, I mean, that's kind of exactly what they were trying to do, was peaceful ways to find, how to make a better society. And so that was an idea that both Calvin Stowe and Harriet Beecher Stowe really believed in. And so how did they make that, do their part? So they built, or largely paid for the building of 2 buildings in addition to their house. And these did not have trees in them, so maybe that'd be better engineering. The one on the left was the church that they built, right essentially across the street from where their home was. The one on the right was the schoolhouse. That one still stands. It's the community center. If you go down Mandarin Road in Mandarin, you would see this as you're driving off of whatever that is. It's on the left. The church, unfortunately, was destroyed in Hurricane Dora in 1964. So it just, apparently that tree just went smack through it and there wasn't anything left. And so you can't see that, but the community center, former school, is still there. Their home is also gone, but there is a plaque out there. You'll know you found the right spot because there's a plaque telling you this is where they lived, and it was right on the river and across the street from that building that still remains. She's very much a part of the town there still in many ways. The museum has a real tribute to her. We'll look at that in a sec. Also, she asked when they left in 1884, he had started to develop dementia. And that move every year was real tough. I mean, I was reading descriptions. They didn't just sort of keep it furnished or rent some furniture when they got there. They had chairs disassembled in their home in Hartford, put on the train, came down, reassembled. Then when it came time to go back to Hartford, put the chairs back together. So it was a thing. When they left, she asked the community said, what can we do? And she said, well, I would love to have a window made as a tribute to my husband. So Louis Comfort Tiffany, who was a great admirer of Harriet Beecher Stowe, got the commission. And it was some years after her death that actually was installed, but it was, by all accounts, a very beautiful window. That's a photo of it. Unfortunately, when the hurricane came through and destroyed the church, it destroyed the window too. You can see some little shards of glass if you go to the museum to get the sense of the richness of the glass, but the window is gone. So this is the other part. I mentioned the doing work, trying to do good deeds. She was a big promoter of tourism in Florida, and we talk about this period here, for example, for being very important to the development of tourism in this area, and it was. The 1870s, the early 1870s are the area that seemed to really get the credit, the era that gets the credit for developing tourism. But in fact, a couple of historians have looked at it and said, no, it really was happening right after the Civil War. And Harriet Stowe was doing a lot of writing about how attractive North Florida was and the potential for coming here and making your fortune. And so I think that that is an important piece of her story that made a difference here, and I think is really worth thinking about. She wrote 57 letters that were published. These weren't just notes to friends. These were published in a book about Florida during Reconstruction. The book's Palmetto Leaves, and she was enthusiastic, but I think people trusted her. She would talk about, you're going to have to work hard, and it's pretty hot, and oh yeah, the bugs, but I mean, she did make it sound like a place you'd want to go visit. And so there were a lot of reasons for Florida. She saw them, she saw the potential, and I think it made a difference in terms of people saying, yeah, well, maybe we ought to give it a try. Let's at least go look and spend some tourist dollars. Mm-hmm. So, as I mentioned, the promotion's important. I know we're getting short on time, so I just want to mention, the name of the book is Palmetto Leaves. It's still available. In fact, you can get it for free on the internet if you want to do some reading. She was gifted. She was a good travel writer. She could tell you the story, tell you the journey. Here you see she mentions Fernandina. She also was very ahead of her time, probably, in terms of environmental commentary. She would talk about the unique animals here and the flora, the fauna, etc., and then show some outrage about how wasteful people were. They were renting spots on the riverboats and just coming up and just shooting at will, whatever they could shoot at. And she said, this is a dumb idea. And so that was important. People listened to her. She was a lovely writer. I mean, she was a product of her times. It was the Victorian era. But some of her writing about agriculture and the beauty of the land is just really amazing. So it's a nice book to take a look at. And the last thing, she was practical. She promoted agriculture and said the land is good here, you can make a go of it. And she would talk about her, the opportunity for jobs and so forth. And so she did a lot to bring people here. As I mentioned, the house is gone. It sat, as it turned out, none of her 6 children were all that impressed with Mandarin, unfortunately. One of the sons did end up in Tallahassee and liked Florida, but the others, especially her daughters, they were really tired of having to take those chairs apart and put them back together, apparently. And everybody noticed that air conditioning would be a really nice thing if somebody would just go and invent that. So they did not keep their ties here. But you can, go and see the plaque in the community center and so forth. So did she have an impact? Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. Reconstruction happened. The Jim Crow's law happened. Things did not change overnight, and I don't want to try to give you that impression at all. But she did leave an impact, clearly. And her support symbolically certainly meant something. She's alive and well and living in Mandarin for sure. That community really sees her as a hero. This is, in November, they did a unveiling of a statue that is supposed to be the only statue to Harriet Beecher Stowe in the country. It was done, the woman in the white jacket is the sculptor, Barbara Council, and she has ties to this area, but she's a nationally known sculptor. It shows Harriet reading to a small white child and black child, who have just written their names for the first time. It's a little hard to, I wanted to get the picture of the sculptor in. This is a study that she did for it. You get a better sense of it, that it's sort of a two-part sculpture. And they have that at the museum now. And you can see a whole lot more about her at the museum if you decide you want to go and see. She was a painter, and they have some of her work, and it's an interesting exhibit to see. I asked you the question, how were they different? Maybe we've got some thoughts now about how they were alike. They were both known, they were like 5 feet tall, and they were really small women. And they were both very religious in very different ways. Harriet, Stowe, more from the traditional church. Harriet Tubman, very, very religious, believed that God would provide. She didn't worry about the fact that she didn't have a lot of money. You know, God would take care of it, and apparently did for her. Obviously, both were courageous. Harriet Beecher, I've talked about the popularity of her books, and they were, but she got a lot of hate mail, and some of it really scary. So there was that, the vision that they both shared, their dedication to philanthropy, and you know, I think no matter what you say, obviously a very strong historic impact. So that's what I had. Thank you guys very much.
I know we passed the time, but you're free to go. If you have some questions, you're free to stay as long as you want.
Thank you.
That's okay.
Talk about passing the, sorry about passing the time. Yes, ma'am.
Harriet Tubman, toward the end of her life, was involved with the women's right to vote in the 1960s. I think she died in 13,
right.
but she had been involved for
Yes.
several years with that.
Yes. Thank you for mentioning that. Yes, she didn't say, okay, my work here is done. You know, she, up until her final days, was very much a person who saw a better world. That's true. Yes, sir.
How many people at a time did she carry up?
Out. I have seen estimates. She didn't say. Right, but probably, you know, just to get to the number 300, it had to be at least 20. The groups that she put together were interesting. Sometimes it was all family, and other times it was a wide variety of people, you know, that they could find out about it and that she trusted enough to go to. And sometimes it was literally infants. I mean, they, and if she had infants, they would give them a mild level of drugs to
So
keep
she
them.
must have done some interviews of the people that she was taking?
Somehow, yeah, I don't know how the coalition was put. I think there was a lot of grapevine, you know, where people hoped they could trust somebody enough, because that was, you know, a constant.
She got away with murder for most of her.
She did. So obviously she had a lot of help. And the one thing that's really interesting to me, I mentioned the quilts. There's a book that was done recently about how the African American community developed a series of symbols to put on quilts, and a system of where you'd hang the quilt so you'd know to look that Harriet's coming, you know, or look out for this path. We're here that there's slave hunters that are in this area, go this way instead. And that was conveyed a lot of times, certainly not in the written word, but a lot of times by either word of
Did
mouth.
they mention those people who worked together with her? As it, you know, it was more, she wasn't alone.
Well, on the actual leading of the enslaved people, she probably was mostly alone, in terms of leading it. But funding it and getting the word out, yeah. There was a very active abolitionist movement in the North. I mentioned that John Brown actually was before he got quite as radical, it was a big part of that. Frederick Douglass, and again, the Quaker Church was very involved, of people who would, help fund her. You know, they'd pass the hat, there'd be these quiet little meetings that people weren't, I mean, they couldn't take out an ad, obviously, after 1850, you know, Harriet Tubman was going to be in town. So yeah, there was a support team, but again, you know, she was funding a lot of it with bake sales, so it had to have been a fairly small one. But her stature grew quite a bit over time. Again, at the very beginning, they didn't know whether she was a man or a woman, whether she was actually a little consortium group that sort of was known as Moses. eventually she got more and more of a public face. But obviously that brought with, especially since she was going back to the area she was from, you know, to do a lot of her, she was a gutsy woman, you know, I mean, really gutsy. Yes.
I just visited the Harriet Tubman Museum in Maryland. It's in Cambridge. It's so moving. I recommend anybody, if you're up in the Maryland area, go see it. It's about 2 hours from Annapolis.
Oh, thank you for saying
And
that.
I learned when I visited there, when I lived in Annapolis, that she knew a lot about plants, but she also knew a lot about wild animals, because at night, one of her assignments as an 8 or 10-year-old child was to go out and get the muskrats from the muskrat traps and bring them back to the plantation owner.
Yeah, she was, just from the get-go, what she apparently wasn't good at was tasks like dusting and sweeping. She apparently got in quite a lot of trouble with the woman who was overseeing her for that. And that's where she kind of got thrown out into working in the lumber yard, which she loved. You mentioned Maryland, thank you for that. I wanted to also mention the general, I said that she was known as the general, and by the generals in the Army, that was a sign of respect. Actually, earlier this year, I believe it was this year or late last, the Maryland National Guard, again, she was from Maryland, actually gave her an award as an honorary general. She now posthumously has the title of general. She's a 1-star general in the Guard in Maryland. So that's what I kind of mean by her stature. I think is really basically done nothing but grow.
One thing so cool about that museum is that you're driving through the very territory that she would have walked through. And a lot of it is now open farmland. But then it was all covered with trees, and you can see all those trees and the marsh.
Right.
It's just not an easy journey.
No, absolutely not. I mean, I can't imagine doing that when there was nobody hunting me, much less doing it when you had that and the lives of, 20 people, 30 people at a time, including little kids.
Just, let me say something.
Yes.
On the 22nd, we had a wonderful bus trip, my wife and I and Sylvia. It was a Gullah Geechee historical Juneteenth tour. Savannah, Macon, Birmingham, Montgomery, Selma, Biloxi, and back home. But we visited the Harriet Tubman Museum in Macon, Georgia. And it was wonderful, wonderful. And I might have overlooked it, but I didn't see Amelia Island mentioned there. It probably was, but it was so much to see.
Yeah.
It was just a wonderful, wonderful museum right there in Macon, Georgia.
How cool.
It was fantastic.
Yeah, I've seen the sign from the interstate. And,
I might mention that in Covington, Kentucky, right across from Cincinnati, there is the National Underground Railroad Museum, and I grew up kind of in that area, where they have murals showing how they brought across the river, and there are all these stories about the tunnels that would lead up to Mount Auburn and further north.
Yeah.
Because Mount Auburn was a subdivision away from the river, and they would make their way through these underground tunnels into basements and on up.
They're literally,
It's
still
really amazing.
unearthing underground tunnels and safe houses and stuff. So it's very much a lot more history to be written.
Yeah.
Some years ago with volunteering here with the museum, that the Williams house had some connection to the Underground Railroad. Was that true?
I don't know, but I have heard that also, and that there's some others in town that they think might have. There was, as I was saying, there was a Southern Underground Railroad where Texas and Florida were the 2 destination states. And that's a whole probably topic unto itself. So my guess is, if that's, and this is a guess, but that if that is true, that it was a destination point, there almost have to be. With as many houses and buildings that have been preserved here, that it may be a matter of just opening up that false wall and going, oh.
Where is the Williams house? Where is that?
Where the Williams house is, which street?
10th Street.
10th?
10th and Ash.
9th and Ash, okay.
Oh, 9th and Ash. 9th and Ash.
Well, thank you again, guys. I appreciate it very much.